My first job is to lower any expectations that you've got. Really, I honestly was making slides a few minutes ago to put in this. Chris said, hey, while you're here, I'm here working with SEP. I've worked with SEP off and on for several years. For those of you who don't know me, in the Agile community, I've been very passionate about user experience work and good product design work, and have been for a very long time. And SEP as a company has they've been focusing on a lot of that stuff as well. I'm here working with SEP for 3 days. Chris said, would you mind talking one night this week? I said, sure, no problem. And I didn't give it much thought until about an hour ago. So, but I'm leveraging some things. I could leverage something I've done before, but I thought, no, I kind of want to mix this up a little bit, so I can't leave anything alone. I'm mixing some things in. I'm going to try doing things a little bit differently tonight. So this could fail. Let's start from the beginning. In way of self-introduction, I'm an art school dropout. I went to university to be a graphic artist, a commercial artist. I had a lot of fine art classes, a lot of advertising design classes, and I spent enough time there to realize that this was going to be really hard, require a lot of study and practice to get really good at, and then I'd get out of college and make crap money. And I thought, for me at least, programming was a little bit easier, so I went into software development. Now, when I finally landed in software development, and I was a software developer, because I knew a little bit of something about how things looked, or what things that, let me shorten this. I could design user interface pretty well, especially compared to the other developers. My UI sucked a lot less than theirs did. So as a UI designer, I was the man. Everybody in my company thought I was fabulous. I could design stuff that they loved. Customers reviewed it, and they thought it was great. And a lot of things went to me. I got to be customer facing a lot. How many of you have ever sat with a customer as they've used your software for the first time? When you think back to that first experience, how did it go? So I found out pretty quickly that, I was the man up until that point. It's when you first ship things that you realize, you have one of two reactions. I had multiple situations where my customers looked it over. They all agreed it was fabulous until they sat down to use it, and then it wasn't. And I could come out of that experience saying customers never know what they want, the bad requirements, all kinds of things. Or I could say, look, I honestly thought this was better. I have ideas. I can make this better. And I cared, and I wanted to do that. Now, in my company, I was a UI person, but I got pushed out front a lot, and because I screwed up so much, and I did, my company decided that I should be in charge, and so I was made a product manager, and I've built on top of years of mistakes, including, in 2000, I was lucky enough, hey, look, somebody in my company left, and he was an executive, and I got poached to join this cool startup in San Francisco. Their secret sauce was, they were going to use this new process called extreme programming. They'd hired this guy named Kent Beck, who had written this book called Extreme Programming Explained. And this was in 2000. The term Agile was coined in 2001. XP became, fell into that wrapper term, as did Scrum and other things like that. So I got a very early start with that stuff. My intro's taking too long here. Let me see if I can distill this here. I've hated Agile development since the first day I encountered it. I learned in Agile development that you're supposed to get a smart person, put them in the room, and code what they say. They call that the product owner or the customer, and I learned the hard way in my first decade of software development that I wasn't smart enough, and I've learned a lot in Agile development. I've misunderstood stories and what they were for the first 8 to 10 years of my career, and my goal today is to help you learn from mistakes, or at least my mistakes. Now, there are a lot of things that I see people have as common assumptions, and let me see if I can spill these out, and let's see how many of these I get through. That's a lot. Well, first off, actually I'll rearrange these. I think I rearranged these already, but look, the best requirements aren't written down, and building software really isn't the point anyway. Stories don't replace documentation, not in Agile projects. The product owner does not make the best product decisions. I can speak from experience there. Look, there's no correct size for a story. I've been told by a lot of people there is, and it took me a long time to figure that out. And look, backlogs will not help you understand a product. Your backlog always has too much in it anyway. Good acceptance criteria won't get you the software you expect, and after all that, you're building the wrong thing anyway. Let's start from the beginning. This is the point I rearranged. I decided to put this first. Now, people that have heard me talk, who here has heard me talk anywhere before ever? Okay, tune out for a minute. I'm going to draw this model over and over until people say, I've got it, shut up. For the people that haven't heard this, first off, the thing to become crystal clear about here is it is not your job to build software. If you're in the software business, I labored under the false impression that my job was to build software for a long time until I figured out that my job is actually to change the world. Now, this sounds like a lofty goal. You might think that's a big deal, but in fact, you do it, and your only choice here is to be intentional about it, or be frightened by it and not talk about it. Everybody see what I'm drawing here? You ever seen anybody present where they draw on flip chart paper and they pretend that people in the back room can read it? This is my alternative here. All right, the way this model starts is we look at the world as it is now. If I'm looking at the people that might buy or use my product, I'll find people that aren't particularly happy. They could be unhappy because, well, they should be using a product that I make. We'll find people that are worse than happy, people that are mad or frustrated, or people that are confused. It's looking at these people and watching them work that gives us, this is what gives us ideas. Now, if we're launching a startup, those could be ideas for whole new products. If we've got existing products, and most organizations I work with already have existing products, so this will give us ideas for features or enhancements. And those are the things that we eventually start referring to as our requirements. Now, I'll come back to this, but whatever you call, you may use the word requirements a lot, but don't forget that this is just another word for our great ideas that solve people's problems. Now, if I move forward from here, whatever process you use, Agile, Waterfall, anything, hopefully at some point in time you go through some process and something comes out. You ship a piece of software, and this lands into the world in the future or later after some time. What we hope is true, we hope that those people that were unhappy are now happy. And everybody's not equally happy, and there are some people there's just no pleasing. Here's the vocabulary words I want to incorporate here. Look, it's everything between the idea and this delivery. I'm going to refer to as output. You know you're talking about output when you're talking about products or features or enhancements. You know you're kind of hand-wringing about it when you think about time and cost. And a lot of Agile processes kind of optimize for this, and in Agile development we have the new word velocity that we worry about. And we worry about what our velocity is, and we try and increase it a lot. But hey, if you think of a product that you use every day that you really love, think about why you love it. Ponder for a second. I promise you weren't thinking, I love this product because it was delivered on time. Well, these people, first off, when they get the product, we hope they're happier. And, I want to refer to this as this is outcome. It's called outcome because this is what happens when things come out. We don't measure outcome in terms of products or features or enhancements delivered. The way we measure outcome is, by how these people change their behavior. What I mean by that is, look, before they were doing something, they're trying to accomplish something. Because, we build software, we build tools, and now they can use our product, and it's easier to do. It's faster to do. It solves a problem they couldn't solve before, and changing the way they work can affect their satisfaction. These people are happier. And the way when we're talking about requirements, sometimes we'll often use the words capability to do something. But if we deliver a capability to, but no one does it, that's not good. That's kind of an absence of outcome. If you deliver a capability to and people do it, but they really hate it, that's a bad outcome. We change the world by changing it in a little way for these people, and we either make it better or worse. And we either take responsibility for that, or we don't, or we blame the requirements. Now, when you draw the model this way, it looks like it's all about making people happy. But in fact, it starts upstream. If you work for a company that builds software, it starts inside the building. And if we look at our company and things aren't going the way we want, or we want to grow, or other things are wrong, that makes people inside the building unhappy, or the business, or the leadership of the organization. That hopefully compels them to look at their customers and users or systems that are going on internally. And if we look at the way those people work, it follows all the way through here. If a few customers buy or use a product or change the way they work, that's cool. But if lots of users do that, that eventually results in something we can see and measure from the business. And that makes people happy inside the business. The word I want to use for this longer term benefit here is impact. It takes a lot of people changing things to impact things like return on investment. It also takes time. If we are concerned about our brand perception, that's going to take time. Those are the kinds of things that, it takes lots of delivery of lots of potentially multiple releases of a product, multiple features to do impactful things. If your organization measures software success with return on investment, it's important to understand that this is a lagging indicator. Measuring based upon return on investment is a little bit like driving by watching your rear view mirror. By the time, you can see what you've run over. By the time your return on investment goes down, or you notice you're not making money, lots of people have hated you for quite a while. That's what's going on here. Now, let's see if I can, let's frame this here. Your job is not to build more software. Your job is to build less. There are always more ideas than we can ever build. If you double your velocity, double the speed that you can build things, I promise you will quadruple the amount of ideas you come up with. The more customers you sell to, the more ideas they'll come up with. So success breeds this. At the end of the day, if you can build less, or let's put this another way, if you can minimize output at the same time that you maximize outcome and impact, that's the game we're playing here. Let me come back to this word requirement for a minute. I started a software company that built software for brick and mortar retailers, for largest chain retailers, anywhere from 100 to well over 1,000 stores. When I started the company, I was employee number 38, but over time we grew up into over 300, into 300 to 400 range, and we had some offshore development going. In the early days, I knew that I could talk directly to my customers and users, but I know when they gave me their ideas, they didn't have each other's best interest at heart, and they didn't have my business's best interest at heart. I built something that they loved, other people might not, and they weren't looking after my ROI or my brand perception. We knew that we were just making good decisions, given our limited resources, to get the best outcome and impact that we could. We didn't use this word requirements much. We thought of it as just decisions, and once in a while we did. But over time we hired more people, and more traditional software people kept coming in, and they would often say the word requirements. I remember a lady came to me one day and said, Jeff, we've got a release coming up. I need you to add these enhancements to the area of the product you're responsible for. I said, great. Tell me a little bit about what customers need them and what kind of problems this solves for them. And she looked at me and said, well, they're requirements. And I said, yeah, I get it. Where in the product does it fall, and what users use these, and how does this help them? And she looked at me like I was stupid and said, they're requirements. When I learned that this word means shut up. This is Kent Beck. This is the consultant my company had hired in 2000. He had written this book called Extreme Programming Explained. Has anybody read that book? Have you read the first edition or the second edition? First edition. So there's a first edition and there's a second edition. For the people in the know, they understand those as the Old and the New Testament. In the second edition, he became a kinder, gentler methodologist, more forgiving. In the book, both first and second edition, he introduced this concept of stories. And in introducing the concept, he said, software development has been steered wrong by the word requirement, defined in the dictionary as something mandatory or obligatory. The word carries a connotation of absolutism and permanence, inhibitors to embracing change, and the word requirement is just plain wrong. Now, what Kent's talking about is there's always too much to build. We can't assume things are required. It's our job to better understand why we're building what we're building and to really focus on people getting benefit. Well, let's go forward here. Kent had a sort of a dead simple idea. Let's see if I can find the one I'm looking for here. Kent's disruptively simple idea was, to stop exchanging documents or stop writing requirements. If we could just get together and you would tell me your story. If you've got something that you want, write it down on a card, and then we'll work together with someone who will build it, and together we'll have this discussion about what we should be building, and we'll talk about who, what, and why. We'll focus on what we could build to maximize outcome and impact and minimize output. Look, stories get their name from how they're supposed to be used, not how we write them. And one of the we've suffered with written documentation for a long time. We've suffered with Kent wanted to start the conversation and start focusing on how we could pay attention to the problems we're solving. Now, let's go to thing 2 here. It's time for that. I've already mentioned that stories get their name from how they're supposed to be used, not how they're supposed to be written. And let's talk about the problem with things that are written. Has anybody here seen or read the story mapping book before? It's kind of a reprise of that too. Okay, you're hearing the same stuff. Look, imagine for a minute someone in your office is going away, and you're going to hold a going away party. You call and order a cake. They say, well, what would you like written on it? You say, can you write "So Long, Alicia" in purple and put stars around it? They write it down, they hand it off, the decorator gets it, and this is what you get back. It meets the requirements. It's exactly what was written down. Now, this is a cake from a website called Cake Rex. Go there and spend time there. If you've got a lot of time to spend, Jen Yates, the original author of the site, is a great writer. The stuff is funny stuff. She has written 2 books. As many books as I sell, she will sell 10 times as many. This is the cover of her first book, and you can see there's a reoccurring theme in a lot of the Cake Recs, not all of them. Basically, these are what she calls a literal, where people literally do exactly what was written down. This means no, you can't have sprinkles. There are the non-functional requirements. And at some level, you just... No process fix is stupid. Now, look, you know that we should just hire smarter people, things would go better, but if you've been in Agile development, you've been in software development for a while, you know that you've turned over perfectly good, well-written documents to people that you know are smart, and still dumb things happen. The one dumb thing example I've got here, and I could come up with more, but this is a NASA example. It's kind of old now. This is 1999. NASA launched something called a Mars orbiter. It turns out the dumbest thing about it was its name, because the one thing it could not do is orbit. It flew directly to Mars and then crashed into Mars. Or the people think now it might have flown past Mars, but we're not really sure. There are 2 ground control teams that were writing software. They were exchanging values. This is well documented. But one was using English units, one was using metric units. This causes small calculation errors that don't make a huge deal in a short distance, but between here to Mars it tends to matter. The problem is when you write documents, people may read exactly the same documents. They may sign off on it. They may say, I get it. They may say that we agree. But they're thinking different things. Let's fast forward here. This problem happens when we speak as well. If we talk about features, we talk about customers, we talk about users, we can nod and we can say we agree. But one of the things I've learned about storytelling is, we need to go just a little bit deeper. It's when we externalize our thinking. If we explain back, if we draw back, if we use words and pictures, we start to realize, I don't see it exactly the same way that you do. And it's not that I'm right and you're wrong, it's that we all have different pieces of the puzzle. It's when we combine and refine what we understand that, we come up with a different understanding. And when we leave that conversation, we may still say the same feature names, still talk about the same customers, still use the same words, but we have this less tangible state of shared understanding. In traditional software processes, we mistake shared documents for shared understanding. And we pass those off and we ask people to sign off on them, as if signing off on them, I can't help but rant, as if signing the document means you understand it, like you read all those agreements you signed to get credit cards or finance your house, even though that's your signature, even though you signed off. Look, when we're having good story conversations, they look a lot more like this. There's a lot of pointing, a lot of gesturing, a lot of figures. It's us telling stories and us making sure that people understand. Now, there's some data that proves that if I just tell you facts, that means I'm not so likely to remember them. But if I tell you facts, embedded in a story, you're a lot more likely to remember them. And when we tell stories about who's using our product and why, and that's the point. Story conversations have artifacts, they have words and pictures. Are people here familiar with a company called Atlassian? They make a product called Jira. They make a product called Confluence. When I'll visit Atlassian in Sydney once in a while, and when I walk into Atlassian, when I walk into any Agile shop, I'll usually see lots of stuff all over the walls. Most Agile shops have like burn down charts and task boards and all kinds of things that show what we're working on, that show our progress. At Atlassian, I don't see any of that. They make a product called Jira. Why would they put burn down charts on the wall? It's in Jira. Why would they put task boards on the wall? It's in Jira. But their walls are covered, but they're covered with the things that don't go in Jira, that don't go in Confluence. They're covered with things like flows of screens and lots of handwritten notes, and every team has an alcove that's covered with all sorts of things that they can walk in front of, talk in front of, have conversations in front of, and build shared understanding. They know that, look, a tool isn't the best way to do that. A tool is a good way for us to store stuff that we talked about. It isn't a best way for us to get on the same page. If you're doing this story thing right, we document a lot, we write down a lot, but it's not the same way that we used to write. All the documents we create in an Agile context have this quality of a vacation photo. What I mean by that, well, to tell you what I mean by that, I have to share one of my vacation photos. These are my kids, and this is on a trip to Hawaii. Now, if I were to share this with you, you might say they're cute and say something polite like that looks fun. I don't know what you can infer from looking at that. But when I see that particular photo, I remember that on this particular trip to the Big Island of Hawaii, Big Island of Hawaii is really rocky and really dry, at least on the west side. It looks a lot more like Idaho than Hawaii does. All the beaches were either really rocky, and you couldn't get out on them, or if they were sandy, they were covered with people. It was super crowded. My kids were saying, the beaches suck, we want to swim in the hotel pool. I said, we do not pay this much money to go to Hawaii to swim in a hotel pool. I found a nice, what sounded like a good beach on TripAdvisor. The TripAdvisor warned that it's a little bit hard to get to. What that translated to was an hour's drive over a four-wheel drive trail, which is a bad idea in a rental Ford Mustang. And when we got there, there was a small parking lot with just a few cars in it. This is a good sign. When we get out of the car, we're looking for the beach. There's no beach. There is a long trail over lava rock, because there's a ton of that there, and it's not over it. It's not a nice easy trail. It's a lot of climbing and other stuff. And we're hoping there's a beach at the end. Now, if you have kids, you know how this is going. My kids are begging, can we please just go back to the hotel pool? As any good father would, I said, no, we're going to the beach. And we got there. When we got there, it was fabulous. There's hardly anybody on the beach. There are sea turtles up on the shore. There's a lot of turtles in the water. There's good places to snorkel, lots of open beach with nobody on it. It was a great day. Now look, I'm not trying to sell Hawaii to you, but the point is, when I see the picture, I remember all that. It comes back to me because I was there. When these people look at what they're creating, it's not what's documented, it's not what's written down, it's all the memories that come flooding back, it's all the conversations that come flooding back. The best documents we create are the ones that help us remember what we talked about. All right. Let's see what else I've got here if I go in order. Just remember I changed the order at the last minute here. Look, stories. I think I've already given this point here that, look, stories don't replace documentation. Stories have this simple life cycle of we can write down a bunch of things and put it in a backlog. People stress a lot about how they write stories. If I hear one more time, how do I write good stories, I'll kill myself, because that's not why they're called that. The point is, because they're stories, we write them how they make sense to us when we're organizing them, but we know we're going to have a conversation. And in this conversation, I'm going to get a chance to explain to you what I mean. And look, in an old school process, it's the blue guy's job to get it right, and the green guy's job to get it right, the blue guy's job to understand it. But because this is a conversation, the blue eye can ask questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And because this is a conversation with words and pictures, well, we support all those. We support that conversation with use cases, with workflow models, with UI sketches, with traditional. Gosh, I'm working with people that are still doing UML, things like that. That's okay. Just be prepared to bring it into the conversation, be prepared to talk about it, be prepared to mark it up and annotate it, and be prepared to change it. Now, this last best conversation is where we get a little concerned that we agree on what to build. Let me tell a story about this particular person quickly. In the late 90s, before even the Extreme Programming book was published, when Extreme Programming and Stories were a bunch of papers and a lot of information on a wiki, Rachel worked for a company called Connextra. They adopted using user stories, and the idea was there's a backlog, a list of stories out there that anybody can contribute anything into. And so that's exactly what happened. People would drop anything in, put it on a card, then Rachel and her team would try and pick it up and try and figure out what the hell does this mean and who wrote it. And they'd finally try and decipher by the handwriting who wrote it. Then they would find that person and go talk to them, and they'd ask some basic questions like, well, who is this for? And what will happen when they use it? And what does this mean? And after a short conversation, the people would say, now that I think about it, I don't think that's a good idea. Never mind. And she said, look, this is sucking a lot. Look, we need a better story card format. So they came up with this thing. This is something they, in 2001 at an XP conference, they showed this template as a clever idea to help people out. Notice the story still has a very good title. Stories need a good short title, just like a good book has a good title, but it has this conversation starter that starts with, as a type of user, I want something, or I want to be able to do something so that I can get this benefit. It also has the name of the person who wrote it and the date, and it has room for estimates and other things. And well, this is a conversation starter. It doesn't finish the conversation. And I'll tell you, for Rachel and for Connextra, the real purpose of it was a little defensive. It was to make sure that people just gave it a little thought before putting it in. The writing of this story was kind of a first best conversation, or at least it helped them vet things just a bit. When you're actually having story conversations, the discussion about who is a little less shallow. I work with a lot of companies that build consumer products, and there are a great number of different types of users. We can think of we have to also talk about the stakeholders and why they want users to be using this and their interests we're protecting. The what's may be what users see on the screen, but if we're building things that are headless or back-end services, the what's aren't things people see on the screen, and the whys are a little layered. And look, there's why a user would want them, there's why our business wants the user to want them, there's why we're building any of this at all, and how it ultimately serves the business strategy. Story conversations just don't fit into that template. But they help you weed out dumb ideas sometimes. So, look, in the interest of time, let's go forward here. Look, one of the misconceptions that I see a lot is that there's a product onna, and actually I saw this when I first encountered Agile development, because in the company I started at, they said we're using this new. Back in 2000, they said, we're using this new process called Extreme Programming. This is the way it works. There's somebody that's in a customer role, or in our company, they're called product managers, and there are developers. And I thought about it, and I said, look, this is great, because I do both of those. And they said, that's not the way Agile works. You have to be one or the other. And I said, oh, gosh, let me give it some thought. And, well, I like coding too much. So I'm going to be a developer. And they said, actually, you can't be a developer. You're just not good enough. And we hired you because you've released successful products in this market, so you need to be the product owner. And it was my job to tell people exactly what to build. Now, I'd learned the hard way a long time ago that I had to spend time with people, and I had to talk with a lot of people. I had to figure this stuff out. So, I think let me see if I can clear up this misconception. I leverage a lot of models and thinking from a person named Marty Kagan. Marty Kagan's, he wrote a book on product management called Inspired. His claim to fame is being a longtime Silicon Valley product manager. One of the first product managers at Netscape, working for Horowitz and Andreessen, and then when Netscape was bought by AOL, he went to this startup called eBay. It was still kind of small. eBay had 3 product managers, and he was the 3rd product manager, and he helped grow up eBay, left eBay in late, I think about 2008 or 9, but by that time he had grown eBay up to a pretty huge company. He was in charge of all product management and user experience. So if you were a product manager working for Marty, he would say, look, your job is to create a product that is an intersection of these 3 things. It needs to be valuable to our organization and valuable to the people who are going to use it. It needs to be usable by those people, because if they can't use it, they aren't going to get any value out of it. And if it's valuable and usable, that makes it a little compelling, a little desirable. And finally, it needs to be feasible to build, given the time and tools that we've got. Because any idiot can come up with fabulous stuff that we can't afford to build. If you're a good product manager, you're responsible for, that's the right product. Now, Marty didn't expect you to be an expert in the business, an expert on users and user interface design, and an expert on engineering. He said, if you're going to do this job right, you better understand where the value comes from for our organization, what our business strategy is. You better be working closely with someone that understands user experience practice, that talks with users, can design user interface, and you better be working with somebody close that is an engineer, ideally a senior engineer that knows what they're talking about. This core group of people is what Marty would refer to as a core discovery team. And the product owner's job was to lead that core team. In organizations, I see they're doing this right. In fact, I used to walk into organizations and I'll ask them, how's this Agile stuff going for you? And there's some organizations that really look like it was going well, and they would say, it's going pretty well, except for we know we're not doing it right. And I would say, why aren't you doing it right? What's going wrong here? Things look great. And they would say, our product owner actually doesn't write all the stories or fill in all the backlog. They partner with the UI designer, or they work closely with the engineer. And actually the UI designer and the engineer write a lot of the stories too. And they say, we know we're not doing right, and we're going to try and fix that. But on the other hand, I found a lot of companies that were doing it right, where the product owner did everything. They were overworked, they were stressed, and the team was pissed off at them because they were always behind and never where they should be. And the right way apparently isn't. This is becoming more and more common. I mentioned Atlassian before, and when I walk into Atlassian, they'll look around at their team and say, this is where the team sits, and these 3 desks here at the front, this is where the triad sits. I'll go to Stockholm once or twice a year, and if I walk into companies like Spotify, they'll say, this is where the trio sits. Company in Seattle I'll visit, they'll refer to this as their team of 3, and they'll abbreviate it that way. And I had a weird long conversation with a guy named Eric Ries, if you've heard of that person, the lean startup dude, and he talks about something called a nucleus. It's this core group that works together to get things done. Now, let's get this 5th thing. I've got 15 minutes to go, so let's see how I can slice this thing pretty deep here. Look, who's using user stories in their Agile practice today? Great. If we're worried about using stories for development, I'm going to draw kind of something that looks like a development cycle, an iteration, or a Scrum sprint. And if we're sending stories through that iteration, What's an ideal story? Maybe how big is it, or what kind of qualities does it have? Shout out if you're bold enough. Yeah, it fits. Yeah, it kind of has to. Exactly right. So how big is that for your company? A couple days to build? More than a couple days to build? The sprint is 2 weeks, and you probably want to put more than one in there, I guess. So I hear different things. So an ideal story might be maybe 2 days or less to build, and maybe a little bit more to QA. And we want to be able to build it. We want to be able to test it. We want to be able at the end of the sprint to show it. Now, look. If you're looking at customers that have problems and you come up with ideas for new features, are they 2 days or less to build and test and show inside a sprint? Probably not. In fact, if we look at our big ideas, well, they're big. Now, one of the mistakes a lot of people make is saying, well, those aren't stories because they don't fit all that criteria. But that wasn't ever the point. We can still take these big ideas and write them in a story format. We can still talk about what they are, who they're for, and why we're building them. But I want to distinguish, well, there's different kinds of stories. This is our first important story conversation. And that's first important story conversation. Our job is to make a go or a no-go decision. Now, a go decision doesn't mean we're going to build it. It means we're going to, unpack it. It means we're going to learn more. We've got to learn more to basically understand what it is. And a no-go decision means, after talking about what it is and who it's for, we want to do what Rachel Davies did at Connextra. They want to get people to throw things out or rule things out. It goes into one of our more important backlogs. What does that look like? What does that look like? Well, this is called the output minimizer. And it's during this next phase that we kind of have to unpack that thing. We have to take that big story and we've got to break it down into lots of smaller parts. And, it unpacks quite a bit. Now, this phase of thinking here is about learning fast. Where development is about velocity. It's about building fast and at high quality somewhat predictable, because when our velocity goes up and down, it kind of drives us crazy. If I'm going to call this development, I'm going to call this phase discovery. And discovery is the stuff that complements delivery. And, I'm going to call these ideas, your company may call them a roadmap, or every company commits to things long before we know how big they are, and we make go decisions without much consideration sometimes. I'm going to call these opportunities. That's the polite word for, makes it believe there's something good in there, maybe. It's opportunities that we move forward to discovery and then eventually move forward to development. And frankly, sometimes we kind of move a little bit back and forth between those. These are all stories all the way through. I want these, we could call this an epic, but remember, epic doesn't mean it's not a story, it just means it's a bigger story. I get challenged sometimes by the word epic because I associate it with Beowulf and my junior high school English lit teacher, which I did not like at all. I'll stop there. These are all stories. We have conversations about them, but the conversations we have here aren't about coming up with good acceptance criteria. They're not about the developers being confident they can build them. They're about making this go or no-go decision. the conversations we have here about learning or about breaking things down and about understanding how much of this do we need in order to move forward. And the conversations we have here are those last best conversations. They're exactly what do we agree that we're going to build and how do we move forward with this. See if I can spin down and catch a couple more things and stay within an hour. For the people that need to go, they can. Let's talk about the thing that I'm known for here, and that's, let's talk about that middle thing. I'm known for a practice called story mapping. Let me tell a story that I tell over and over again. This is a story about a guy named Gary. Gary was launching a startup. He's a musician. He has an idea for a product that will help musicians collaborate and work together and promote their work online, things like this. He hires the best development company he can find. It's a small startup that's founded by one of the thought leaders in the Ruby community, and these smart guys talk to Gary. They say, we're using an Agile process. The way this Agile process works is we're going to take your big idea and we're going to break it down into a backlog of a bunch of stories. You're going to prioritize those stories so that the highest priority things are first. And we're going to focus on building those first. You're going to see working software every week because we're going to use really short cycles. You're going to love it. It's going to be great. Gary says, that sounds great. They work for about a week, and Gary sees stuff. He says, this is great. A couple weeks go by, he's seeing more stuff. Gary says, yeah, this is pretty good. A couple more weeks go by, and Gary says, wow, this is taking a long time. I thought you said this was going to take a few months, and that we were going to get this pretty fast. And he was reassured that you can't get it any faster than we build it. We're as good as it gets. And another couple weeks go by, and Gary says, this sucks. I have no idea when I'm going to be done. This is not taking shape. I can't do this anymore. This Agile stuff is awful. So the company was founded by some friends of mine, and they called me up and said, can you go talk to Gary, talk some sense into him, help him understand this Agile stuff. So I showed up to talk to Gary, and Gary was in a Manhattan office. He was moving his office that day, so we had a lot of open floor space. And I flipped into story mode. I talked about, let's talk about your idea. Let's have this first best conversation, and let's talk about what is it, who's it for, and why are you building this? How are you going to benefit from this? And as he's saying things, I'm writing things down. We move things around, we change things, we rip things up, and then we say, well, let's go one level deeper here, and let's talk about the people who use this product. Who are the different types of people? Why would they use it? What benefit do they get out of it? And then let's imagine it's later after you ship this product. Let's tell a kind of a day in the life story of what life would be like for these people using it. And let's start with the user you think is the most critical. And Gary starts talking. He tells a story from the beginning to end. Well, first they would do this, and then they would do this, and then they would do this. And he would get to a point where, I hadn't thought about what happens after that. And we'd talk a little bit about it. We'd write a few things down. And he'd get to a point where he was really excited about it. He'd given it a lot of thought and a lot of smaller steps, details, things would spill out down below. So we get a lot of depth that decomposes some of those steps that users take. And when you look at the shape of things at this point, there's some areas that don't have a lot of depth. It doesn't mean they're simpler. It means he hasn't given it a lot of thought yet. We go all the way to the wall. We turn around and start another layer down below it. We start at 10 in the morning. It's about 3 in the afternoon. And Gary says, wow, this is great. I've been working on this for over a year, building it for the last few months, and I've never understood my product as well as I do now. He said, but this is awful too. This is really big, isn't it? And I said, yeah, we haven't gone through all the users yet, and this is so far looking like 6 to 9 months worth of work. And I said, this is terrible. And I said, well, you've already been on it for a couple months. How much of this have you built? And he said, well, none of it, because now that I see this, I wouldn't have started where I did. This is a story map. It's it's a bunch of stories that tell a bigger story. It's a dead simple idea. It just is, look, tell your story, and as we're telling the story, it kind of naturally breaks itself down. I'll show just a bit of this, but this is, you're watching one of these things being made by a team in Brazil from a company called Globo. Globo's a large media company in Brazil. They're the biggest media company in Brazil. They own television stations, radio stations, newspapers. They make a lot of soap operas and made-for-TV movies and other things like that. This is one small team working on a web property there. If you notice, they start by telling that long green line of cars. They just start by telling the story. They've gone up a level and added these pink cards to the top because, well, that's really long, but if we go up a little bit higher, it makes it a little bit easier to scan it across. This top part of a map we'll call a backbone. You can think of those as just bigger stories that break down into smaller stories. But it's about understanding the product. They're looking at their existing product and they're going back to this thing, and it slowly starts to widen or fatten up as they think of more details. People will ask about those bright green cards in the middle, and they'll say, what's the difference between those and the others? There's no difference, they just ran out of the others. But as they keep working and they keep fattening things up, they keep talking about it and talking about it. They go back, there's a lot more of those bright green cards. They're not afraid to rip them up. They're not afraid to say this doesn't make sense anymore. They widen it and they add more. And over time, this thing starts to stabilize. Now, look, it's not enough to have just words. Look, if I were going to pitch a movie, I can't just hand you the script. Well, if we were going to really invest in this movie, I want to see a storyboard. I want to see words and pictures. They've got stories in there, and they kind of want to talk just a little bit about how it works. They're moving fast to prototype or create a visualization that shows what people might see or look like. And it's after getting this bundle of words and pictures that they can better tell this whole story. All right, there was a key point I made in there about, backlogs don't explain products. In fact, one of the things that drives me nuts is that whole idea of a prioritized backlog. I can't tell what the product does from reading that, but well, the cool thing about these is I can tell what's going on. My favorite technique for breaking stories down here is a map. Let me hit one last point. Look, I'll share slides back, but let's hit this one here. One of the biggest problems I see when people fall into a bit of a requirements mindset is they start breaking things down, and they'll come up with a lot of things. And then they say, okay, let's put those in a backlog and let's start building them. Let me use Global one more time to tell this story. Maybe. It was on that same visit to Global that, well, actually they shot the movie ahead of time, but I worked with that particular team. When I showed up, I'll spend a week there with them, and I'll move around from team to team, and we kind of triage, and I'll spend time helping the team that can use it most. On Monday morning, they said, you've got to go talk to this team. They're really struggling. They've got something big and important to work on. Go help them. When I showed up, it wasn't one team. It was a whole bunch of teams. They were working on a big project to replace the underlying content management system for all this stuff they do. They had multiple product owners with each had their own backlog, and they're there with their paper and they're talking with each other and they're saying, look, we don't know where to get started, we don't know how to plan this thing. And I said, hey, you guys know the drill, I've worked with you before, get it on the wall so you can see it, make it visible so that you build this shared understanding stuff. You can't work together if you don't all have the same mental model for what's going on. I go, okay, yes, we get it. By the end of the day, they've got this all over the wall, and it tells a long journey, not of one user and what they're doing, but the whole life cycle of managing content at Globo from beginning to end. Goes way off to the right. Check back with them at the end of the day. They're saying, yeah, this is great. Doing this, we found that there were lots of holes in our thinking, things we hadn't thought about. We had lots of overlap stuff where I thought I was working on something and somebody else thought they were doing it, and we kind of realized there's dual ownership, or we were doubling up on it. This was great. We learned an awful lot. I worked there during the rest of the week, and by Wednesday I was hearing these guys are in trouble. And I said, no, they're not. I work with them on Monday. They're in good shape. And I said, no, they're in big trouble. Go talk to them again. I showed up, and everybody was arguing, and apparently there was big trouble again. I said, well, what's wrong? And they said, well, we started looking into the details and estimating, and we found that this is going to be a year's worth of work, maybe 14 months. Do you know anybody who's Brazilian? Have you ever met anybody Brazilian? Would you characterize Brazilians as grumpy, pessimistic people or happy, optimistic people? Yeah, they're opposite of French or something like that. But look, when a Brazilian developer tells you 12 to 14 months, that means somewhere between 2 years and never. It ain't going to happen. And I said, look, I know you're CEO, and he wouldn't have asked, this wouldn't be a priority unless there was a good reason, and what's going on? And he said, well, yeah, our CEO wants this to go live for Brazilian elections. Well, when is that? That's in 5 months. I said, well, how do we get this much work done in 5 months? You don't. So we talk about this, and we say, look, when this thing goes live, what kind of outcomes are you looking for? What are the reasons you're doing this? What does success look like for Brazilian elections? And they resolve, we can't replace the whole content management system, but if Brazilian elections are what we focus on, we'll talk about a great go live for that, and we'll have to replace the news website and a couple of the political blogs, and we grab a roll of tape, we slice it across this thing, and they start moving cards around. In the end, the air comes back into the room, the air comes back into the map, and what they've done is slice this thing up so that this minimal viable product is a loaded word, and it would be a little bit longer talk for me to define this, but for them it meant this is the slice where if we delivered it, we would be successful for Brazilian elections. And look, that's the important thing there in the end. This is the agreement we made about, it's a few words that stand in for the agreement we made about being successful for Brazilian elections. And once we get our head wrapped around this, we realize, it isn't features we're prioritizing, it's outcomes we're prioritizing. And if we look at what's going on in the outside world, the people that will use our product, and what are the dates that anchor things, we can come up with a bit of a roadmap that's anchored around these kinds of things. Like reality TV shows are coming right on the back of this, and we've got to build for that. It's outcomes that drive prioritization, and there's always too much to build. It's narrowing your focus and being clear about why we're building. It's the big whys, not the so that's at the end of every story. It's the bigger business whys that drive prioritization. Now, look, I'm 5 minutes over, and I've overstocked my backlog here. But let me see if I can spill out the key points that you've already learned. That it isn't your job to build more software. It's your job to build less. It's to minimize the amount you build. At the same time, you maximize the benefit. That's where really ROI comes from. Stories are about collaborating to build shared understanding and alignment, and you want to keep those models around. They help you remind you of those conversations. You want to pass those off with additional conversations. Product owners don't work alone. They work closely with a core team, and if we talk more about this, that core team works closely with the rest of the team, and users and stakeholders and others. Stories are a way we work, not a way we document, and it's us building this product, not one person telling us what to build. The right size for a story is the right size for the relevant conversation. They're big when we're making go, no-go decisions. They're smaller when we break things down and try and decide which are in or which are out for the next release. And they're even smaller than that when we try and decide what's going into the next sprint. That it's story mapping that helps us understand Well, it helps us understand the product experience, helps us make decisions about, well, what is this product and what part of it do we need? We continuously throw things into that trash. Every time we break things down, we've got an opportunity to cut away fat, to pull out things that we don't need at every stage. And when we're doing these last best conversations just before we build, that's when acceptance criteria matters. That's when we need to make sure that we're involving people. It isn't up to the product owner to write good acceptance criteria. It's up to the team, the people that understand the product, that understand the users, that understand the code, and how to test it. Those are the people that work together. Those are the people that draw in front of whiteboards and work through things. Now, the last thing I didn't talk about that I'm going to leave out here is, well, it's the "you're usually wrong" problem. And the thing I'll leave you with is, I spend most of my career helping people realize that the stuff we chose to build is our hypothesis. And when we start building things, what we're building things to do is, well, to validate that they're the right things to build. This is where lean startup thinking comes in. This is what really activates discovery, turns it into a learning process, not a shoveling process. All right, with that, I'm going to close this thing off. I hope there's something in there useful, something in there that if you had heard me talk before, you hadn't heard before. Thanks for letting me deliver late.